The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the municipal court building as Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his black robe for the fifth time. At 35 years old, he was the youngest judge ever appointed in the city's history, and today was his first day on the bench. His hands were slightly shaky as he arranged the papers on his desk, trying to look as confident as possible. The courtroom was impressive, with its high ceilings and dark wooden panels. The American flag stood proudly behind his chair, and the seal of justice hung on the wall. For Michael, this moment was the result of 10 years of hard work, countless sleepless nights studying law, and endless hours of preparation. As he sat in his new leather chair, memories of his journey flashed through his mind. He remembered his mother's proud tears when he graduated from law school, the long hours he spent as a junior attorney, and the surprise call 3 months ago about his appointment as a judge. Some people had whispered that he was too young, too inexperienced for such an important position. These whispers only made him more determined to prove himself. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "The municipal court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Michael Bennett presiding." Michael's heart beat faster as he entered the courtroom. The faces before him were a mix of lawyers, defendants, and spectators. He noticed some older attorneys giving him questioning looks, probably wondering about his capabilities. He straightened his back and kept his expression serious. "Good morning," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "Please be seated." The first few cases were simple, parking violations and minor traffic offenses. Michael handled them quickly, wanting to show everyone that he knew what he was doing. With each case, he felt more comfortable in his role. He was strict with the fines, believing that being tough would earn him respect. During the morning break, his clerk, Mrs. Thompson, brought him coffee. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had worked at the court for 20 years. "You're doing well, Your Honor," she said with a gentle smile. "Just remember to breathe." Michael nodded, grateful for her support. As he sipped his coffee, he looked at the family photo on his desk, his parents at his law school graduation, both beaming with pride. His father, a construction worker, had always told him that justice should be fair but firm. "Son," he would say, "when you're in a position of power, you have to be strong. People need to know you mean business." The morning passed quickly, and Michael felt more confident with each case. He was proud of how he handled a particularly difficult dispute between two neighbors, and even the senior lawyers seemed to be taking him more seriously now. During lunch, he called his mentor, retired Supreme Court Justice James Richardson. The older judge had guided Michael throughout his career, helping him navigate the complex world of law. "Just trust your training," Justice Richardson had told him last week. "And remember, behind every case is a human story." As the afternoon session began, Michael felt ready for anything. His robe no longer felt too heavy on his shoulders, and his voice carried natural authority. The bailiff handed him the next case file, and Michael opened it, unaware that the next person to enter his courtroom would change everything he thought he knew about being a judge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as the bailiff called the next case. Michael Bennett sat straight in his chair, feeling confident and in control. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, he would face a situation that would challenge everything he believed about justice and make him question his own biases. Looking at his watch, he saw it was 2:15 p.m. The next case seemed simple enough, another traffic violation. But as the doors opened and the defendant walked in, Michael couldn't have known that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon would become one of the most important moments of his career, a moment that would teach him that true justice requires more than just following the letter of the law. Case number 247, Sarah Richardson versus the state, the bailiff announced. A well-dressed black woman in her early 60s walked into the courtroom. Sarah Richardson carried herself with quiet dignity, her silver-streaked hair neatly styled, and her navy blue suit pressed perfectly. As she approached the podium, several regular courthouse employees nodded respectfully in her direction, but Judge Michael Bennett was too focused on the case file to notice these subtle interactions. "Mrs. Richardson, you're here today because you're contesting a traffic violation from May 15th. The officer's report states you ran a stop sign at the corner of Oak and Main Street. How do you plead?" Michael's voice was firm and professional. Sarah stood straight and spoke clearly. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I'd like to explain the circumstances if I may." Michael nodded, already thinking about the many excuses he heard that day. He'd been strict with everyone else, and he wasn't going to change his approach now. Your Honor, Sarah began, pulling out several photographs from her folder. I've been driving for 45 years without a single violation. On the day in question, the stop sign was almost completely hidden by overgrown tree branches. She tried to hand the pictures to the bailiff. Michael felt a twinge of irritation. Everyone seemed to have an excuse. Mrs. Richardson, the law clearly states that drivers must approach each intersection with caution, regardless of visibility issues. I understand that, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. However, I brought documentation showing that 3 other accidents occurred at that same intersection in the past month due to the same issue. I've also filed complaints with the city about the overgrown branches twice in the past year. She spoke with the confidence of someone used to being in courtrooms, but Michael interpreted this as arrogance. He was tired of people trying to outsmart the system. Mrs. Richardson, while I appreciate your detailed explanation, the fact remains that you failed to stop at a stop sign. Whether it was partially hidden or not, you are responsible for approaching the intersection carefully. Sarah tried one more time. Your Honor, if you'll just look at the photographs. That won't be necessary. Michael cut her off, his voice sharp. He noticed a few raised eyebrows among the court staff, but he pressed on. The law is clear on this matter. I'm finding you guilty of the violation. Sarah's expression remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but disappointment. I understand, Your Honor. Michael continued. Given the serious nature of running a stop sign, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $300, plus court costs. A small murmur ran through the courtroom. The usual fine for first-time offenders was much lower, and Sarah's spotless record would typically result in a reduced penalty. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, looked up from her computer with surprise, but Michael ignored her. Sarah nodded quietly. Very well, Your Honor. Will that be all? Yes, Mrs. Richardson. You can pay the fine at the clerk's office. Next case. Michael called out, already looking at the next file. As Sarah gathered her things, Mrs. Thompson approached her and spoke in hushed tones. The 2 women seemed to know each other, but Michael was too busy reviewing his next case to notice their friendly exchange. Before leaving the courtroom, Sarah took one last look at the young judge. Her expression wasn't angry or resentful. Instead, there was something almost like pity in her eyes. She shook her head slightly and walked out with the same dignity she had entered with. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. By the end of the day, Michael felt satisfied with his performance. He had been firm and consistent, just like his father had advised. As he prepared to leave the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson approached his bench. Your Honor, she said hesitantly, about Mrs. Richardson's case. I know I was strict, Mrs. Thompson. The law is the law, Michael replied, packing his briefcase. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth as if to say something more, then changed her mind. Have a good evening, Your Honor. Aren't you attending Judge Richardson's dinner party tonight? Yes, I am. Judge Richardson has been my mentor since law school. I'm looking forward to it. Michael smiled, completely unaware of the connection he had missed. As he left the courthouse, Michael checked his watch. He had just enough time to go home, change, and make it to his mentor's house for dinner. The events of the day were already fading from his mind, but fate had other plans for the young judge's evening. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Michael Bennett pulled up to Judge James Richardson's beautiful 2-story home in the city's most respected neighborhood. He had changed into his best suit and brought an expensive bottle of wine, wanting to impress his mentor as always. The house looked warm and inviting, with lights glowing in all the windows and classical music playing softly from inside. Michael had been to this house many times over the years. Judge Richardson had guided him through law school, helped him prepare for the bar exam, and supported his journey to becoming a judge. But tonight felt special. It was his first dinner here since becoming a judge himself. He walked up the stone pathway, remembering how nervous he'd been the first time he visited 5 years ago. Back then, he was just a young lawyer seeking advice. Now he was Judge Bennett, and he couldn't wait to tell his mentor about his first day in court. Michael rang the doorbell, straightening his tie one last time. The door opened, and his heart stopped. Standing in front of him was the woman he had found just hours ago, Mrs. Sarah Richardson. She was wearing an elegant dark green dress now instead of the blue suit from court, but there was no mistake. It was her. Good evening, Judge Bennett, Sarah said calmly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Please, come in." Michael stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. His mind raced back to every moment in court. His dismissive tone, the maximum fine, the way he had cut her off. Horror washed over him as the reality sank in. This was his mentor's wife. He had treated his mentor's wife like that. "Aye, Mrs. Richardson. Aye," he stammered, still standing in the doorway. "The wine will get warm if you stand out there all evening," Sarah said gently, stepping aside to let him in. Michael walked into the house on shaky legs. The entrance hall, which had always felt welcoming before, now seemed to be closing in around him. Photos he had seen dozens of times but never really looked at suddenly caught his attention. Wedding pictures of Judge Richardson and Sarah, family photos, holiday celebrations. How had he never noticed? "James." Sarah called out. "Judge Bennett is here." Judge Richardson's heavy footsteps came down the hallway. The retired Supreme Court Justice appeared, tall and dignified as always, with a warm smile on his face. "Michael, so good to see you. How was your first day on the bench?" Michael felt the color drain from his face. Before he could answer, Sarah spoke up. "Oh, the judge and I have already met," she said, taking the wine bottle from Michael's trembling hands. "In fact, we had quite an interesting interaction in court today." Judge Richardson looked between his wife and his protégé, curious about the obvious tension. "Is that so? Well, you'll have to tell me all about it over dinner." Michael followed them into the dining room, feeling like he was walking to his own execution. The table was beautifully set for 3 people, with the best china and silverware. Under normal circumstances, you would have been honored by such treatment. Now, each shining plate felt like a mirror reflecting his earlier behavior. "Sarah makes the best pot roast in the city," Judge Richardson said proudly, pulling out a chair for his wife. "You're in for a treat, Michael." "Thank you for having me," Michael managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. As Sarah brought out the food, she moved with the same grace she had shown in court. There was no anger in her actions, no spite in her service. Somehow, this made Michael feel even worse. "So," Judge Richardson said as they sat down, "tell me about your first day. Did you remember what I always taught you about seeing the human being behind each case?" Michael looked at Sarah, who was calmly serving the pot roast. The same person he had refused to really see or hear just hours ago was now serving him dinner in her home. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. "Actually, sir," Michael said, his voice shaking slightly, "I think I may have forgotten that lesson today, and I owe Mrs. Richardson an apology." The evening was just beginning, and Michael Bennett had never felt less like a judge in his life. The dining room felt unusually warm as Michael struggled to eat his pot roast. Each bite seemed to stick in his throat, despite the meat being perfectly cooked. The silver fork in his hand felt heavy, and he couldn't stop his mind from replaying every moment from the courtroom earlier that day. "The green beans are from our garden," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "James has become quite the gardener since his retirement." Judge Richardson smiled proudly. "Yes, trading my law books for gardening tools has been quite the adventure. Though Sarah does most of the real work. I just take the credit." Michael nodded, trying to smile but managing only a weak grimace. He watched as Sarah gracefully passed the breadbasket to her husband, remembering how she had tried to show him the photographs in court. Those same hands that had held evidence he refused to look at were now serving him dinner. "So, Michael," Judge Richardson said, "tell me about some of your cases today. The first day on the bench is always memorable." Michael's mouth went dry. He glanced at Sarah, who was calmly buttering her bread as if this was just another dinner party. "Well, Michael started, his voice cracking. "I had several traffic violations today." "Ah, traffic court." Judge Richardson nodded. "You know, some of the most important lessons in justice can be learned in traffic court. Every case tells a story, doesn't it, Sarah?" Sarah took a sip of water before responding. "Indeed. Sometimes there's quite a bit more to a situation than what appears in the official report." Michael felt his face grow hot. He couldn't help but notice how her words echoed what she had tried to tell him in court. The photographs she had wanted to show him were probably still in her bag somewhere in the house. "I remember my first week as a judge," Judge Richardson continued, unaware of the tension. I thought being strict meant being fair. Then one day, I had this case that changed my whole perspective. As his mentor spoke, Michael noticed the way Judge Richardson looked at his wife, with such deep respect and love. He saw how Sarah gently touched her husband's hand when she passed him the salt, the easy comfort between them built over decades of marriage. The pot roast on Michael's plate was getting cold, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was how he had treated this woman, his mentor's wife, yes, but more importantly, a person who deserved to be heard. Would anyone like more potatoes? Sarah asked, holding up the serving bowl. Yes, please, Judge Richardson said. Michael, you've hardly touched yours. Is everything all right? You seem distracted. Michael looked up from his plate, meeting Sarah's eyes across the table. In them, he saw not anger or resentment, but something that made him feel even worse, understanding. Judge Richardson, Michael said, putting down his fork, there's something I need to tell you about today. But before he could continue, Sarah smoothly interrupted. Perhaps we should have coffee first? I made your favorite apple pie, James. The way she said it, so gracefully deflecting the tension, showed more kindness than Michael knew he deserved. As Sarah stood to clear the plates, Judge Richardson beamed with pride. Michael, you haven't lived until you tried Sarah's apple pie. She won first place at the county fair 3 years running. Michael watched as Sarah moved efficiently between the dining room and kitchen. Each time she passed, she carried herself with the same dignity she had shown in his courtroom. The contrast between his treatment of her and her treatment of him now was becoming painfully clear. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking each uncomfortable moment. Michael's collar felt too tight, and the weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him more heavily with each passing minute. As Sarah returned with the coffee pot, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the room, Michael knew he couldn't keep quiet any longer. The evening had barely reached its halfway point, and already he had learned more about justice and dignity than any law book had ever taught him. After the apple pie was served, Michael couldn't take it anymore. The kindness being shown to him felt worse than any punishment. He placed his dessert fork down and took a deep breath. Judge Richardson, Mrs. Richardson, I need to tell you both something, Michael said, his voice shaking slightly. It's about what happened in my courtroom today. Sarah gently placed her coffee cup on its saucer, while Judge Richardson leaned back in his chair, looking curious. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock. You see, sir, Michael continued, looking at his mentor, Mrs. Richardson appeared in my court today for a traffic violation. He paused, watching as understanding slowly spread across Judge Richardson's face. Did she now? Judge Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly as he turned to look at his wife. Yes, Michael's voice grew quieter. And I didn't handle it well. Actually, I handled it terribly. The words started pouring out faster now. I refused to look at her evidence. I gave her the maximum fine. I didn't listen. I was trying so hard to prove myself that I forgot everything you taught me about justice and fairness. Judge Richardson remained silent, his expression unreadable. Sarah reached over and patted her husband's hand, a gesture that somehow made Michael feel even worse. I was arrogant and dismissive, Michael continued, the shame evident in his voice. Mrs. Richardson tried to show me pictures of a hidden stop sign, tried to explain about previous accidents at that intersection, but I wouldn't even look at them. He turned to Sarah. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Richardson. My behavior was inexcusable. The silence that followed felt endless. Then, to Michael's surprise, Judge Richardson started chuckling softly. Sarah, my dear, he said, turning to his wife, did you know this would happen when you saw him in court today? Sarah smiled gently. I had a feeling dinner might be interesting. Judge Richardson stood up and walked to a cabinet in the corner. He pulled out an old photo album and returned to the table. Michael, let me tell you a story about my first month as a judge. He opened the album to a yellowed newspaper clipping. You see this? 1975. I had just become a judge, and I was determined to show everyone how tough and fair I could be. He handed the clipping to Michael. The article described a young Judge Richardson giving a harsh sentence to an elderly woman for a minor offense, only to discover later that she was the mother of the city's police chief. We all make mistakes when we're starting out, Judge Richardson continued. The real test isn't whether we make them, it's what we learn from them. Michael looked up from the article, his eyes wet. But I was so disrespectful to Mrs. Richardson. Yes, you were, Sarah spoke up, her voice kind but firm. But what matters now is that you recognize it. Those photos I tried to show you. 3 other accidents happened at that intersection because of that hidden stop sign. Yesterday, after another complaint, the city finally trimmed those branches. Judge Richardson nodded. You see, Michael, justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about listening, really listening, to each person who stands before you. Every case, no matter how small, affects someone's life. I understand that now, Michael said quietly. Mrs. Richardson, I want to make this right. First thing tomorrow morning, I'll review your case and reverse the fine. That's a start, Judge Richardson said, closing the photo album. But the real lesson here goes deeper than one traffic ticket. Sarah stood and began collecting the dessert plates. Would anyone like more coffee? Actually, Michael said, standing up, I should probably go. I have a lot to think about. But Judge Richardson waved him back down. Sit, son. The night is young, and clearly, we have much to discuss about what it truly means to be a judge. Michael slowly sat back down, realizing that his real education as a judge was just beginning. The shame of his earlier actions was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Gratitude for this unexpected lesson in humility and wisdom. The grandfather clock struck 9 as Judge Richardson refilled everyone's coffee cups. The tension from dinner had eased, replaced by a different kind of energy, one of learning and understanding. They moved to the more comfortable living room, where family photos covered the walls. Sarah, Judge Richardson said, settling into his favorite armchair, why don't you tell Michael about your first experience in a courtroom? Sarah smoothed her dress and sat on the couch, gesturing for Michael to take the seat across from her. It was 1975, she began. James and I had just started dating. I was the young teacher then, and I went to court to support one of my students. Michael leaned forward, listening intently. This was a side of his mentor's wife he had never known about. The student was a 12-year-old boy, accused of stealing from a convenience store, Sarah continued. The judge wouldn't even look at him, just saw another black kid in his courtroom. Didn't care that the boy was trying to get medicine for his sick grandmother. Didn't want to hear about how he'd offered to work at the store to pay for it. Judge Richardson watched his wife with pride as she spoke. That case changed both our lives, he added. Sarah taught me to see what I was missing from my position of privilege. What happened to the boy? Michael asked softly. The judge sent him to juvenile detention, Sarah replied, her eyes distant with memory. But James was there that day. He was just a lawyer then. He took the case on appeal and got the ruling overturned. That's when I knew he was special. She smiled at her husband. Michael, Judge Richardson leaned forward in his chair. Do you know why I became a judge? Michael shook his head. In all their years together, they'd never discussed this. I became a judge because of Sarah, he said simply. Because she showed me how the system looked from the other side. How a black woman with a master's degree still got treated differently in stores, in schools, and yes, in courtrooms. Sarah reached over and took her husband's hand. And I married him because he was willing to learn, to change, to see beyond his own experience. But today, Michael said, shame creeping back into his voice, I didn't see beyond anything. I just saw what I expected to see. Exactly, Sarah nodded. Just like that judge 45 years ago. You saw a black woman making excuses, not a concerned citizen reporting a genuine safety hazard. The law is important, Michael, Judge Richardson added. But it's not just about rules and punishments. It's about understanding the community you serve. Sarah stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a thick photo album. Let me show you something, she said, sitting next to Michael. She opened the album to show photographs of herself and Judge Richardson at various community events over the decades. We spent 40 years working together in this community, she explained. James from the bench, me from the classroom. We've seen how justice and education go hand in hand. How understanding and compassion can change lives. Michael looked at the photos. Images of Sarah and Judge Richardson at school programs, legal clinics, community centers. In each picture, they were working together to make a difference. That stop sign issue, Sarah continued, I wasn't just complaining about my ticket. I was worried about the children who walked that route to school every day. As a retired teacher, I still care about their safety. I never even asked, Michael said quietly. I never gave you the chance to explain. No, you didn't, Judge Richardson agreed. But you're here now, learning from it. That's what matters. Sarah closed the photo album and placed it on the coffee table. You know, Michael, tomorrow you'll go back to that courtroom. You'll have more cases, more decisions to make. The question is, what will you do differently? Michael sat quietly for a moment, looking at the photo album, then at these two people who were teaching him more about justice in one evening than he'd learned in years of law school. I want to learn, he said finally. I want to understand. Will you both help me? Judge Richardson and Sarah exchanged a warm look, and Michael knew this evening was just the beginning of his real education in justice. Over the next few weeks, Michael Bennett's courtroom began to change. The young judge who had been so eager to prove himself through strict rulings was becoming someone different, someone better. On this particular morning, 3 weeks after that life-changing dinner at the Richardsons', Michael sat in his chambers reviewing the day's cases. A gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called out. Mrs. Thompson, his clerk, entered with a stack of files. Good morning, Your Honor. You have traffic court in 30 minutes. She paused, smiling. And Judge Richardson's wife called. She wanted to remind you about Sunday dinner. Michael smiled, remembering how these weekly dinners had become a new tradition. Each Sunday, he learned more from Sarah and Judge Richardson about what it truly meant to serve justice. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, he said. And how's that problem with the broken streetlight on Sater Street that you mentioned yesterday? Still waiting for the city to fix it, Your Honor. 3 accidents there this month alone. Michael nodded thoughtfully. A month ago, he wouldn't have even asked about such details. Now he kept a notebook of community issues that came up in court, following Sarah's example of caring about the bigger picture. In the courtroom that morning, a young Hispanic woman stood before him, ticketed for an expired registration. Ms. Rodriguez, Michael said kindly, can you tell me why your registration wasn't renewed on time? A month ago, he would have simply imposed the fine. But now he waited, really listening as the woman explained how she'd lost her job and had to choose between buying medicine for her son's asthma or renewing her car registration. Your Honor, she said, her voice shaking, I know I should have renewed it, but my boy needed his medicine, and I need the car to get to job interviews. Michael thought carefully before speaking. Ms. Rodriguez, the law requires current registration for all vehicles. However, he looked at her directly, remembering how Sarah had tried to show him those photographs. I'm going to give you 30 days to get your registration updated. If you bring proof of registration within that time, we'll dismiss the ticket. The relief on the woman's face reminded him of something Sarah had told him. Sometimes people don't need punishment, they need a chance to make things right. Later that afternoon, Michael visited the intersection where Sarah had received her ticket. The branches had been trimmed, the stop sign clearly visible now. But he noticed other issues, a faded crosswalk, a confusing merge lane. He took out his notebook and made some notes. Back in his office, he began making phone calls to city maintenance, the traffic department, and the school board about various issues he'd noticed or learned about in court. Mrs. Thompson watched with approval as she overheard him advocating for better street signs near schools. At the end of the day, Michael found himself looking at the family photos on his desk. He'd added a new one, a picture taken at last Sunday's dinner with the Richardsons. In it, Sarah was showing him her garden while Judge Richardson laughed at something off-camera. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Don't forget to review those community improvement proposals before Sunday dinner. Michael smiled. Since that first uncomfortable dinner, Sarah had started sending him articles about community justice, suggesting books about bias in the legal system, and sharing her perspectives as both an educator and a black woman. Each conversation helped him see his role as a judge in a new light. Opening his desk drawer, he pulled out a stack of case files, tickets and violations he handled in his first week as judge. He was reviewing them all, looking for cases where he might have been too harsh, too quick to judge, too blind to circumstances. As the evening sun cast long shadows across his office, Michael realized something important. Becoming a judge wasn't just about knowing the law, it was about understanding the people the law was meant to serve. Thanks to one traffic ticket and an uncomfortable dinner, He was finally learning what justice really meant. Mrs. Thompson poked her head in one last time. "Heading home, Your Honor." "Almost," he replied. "Just want to finish reviewing these cases first." She nodded approvingly. "You know, Judge Bennett, you've changed quite a bit these past few weeks." Michael thought about Sarah's quiet dignity, Judge Richardson's wisdom, and all he'd learned from them. "Yes," he said softly, "I certainly have." 1 year had passed since that life-changing dinner at the Richardsons'. Judge Michael Bennett stood at the podium of the State Judicial Conference, looking out at hundreds of fellow judges. Among them sat Judge Richardson and Sarah, both smiling encouragingly from the front row. "When I first became a judge," Michael began, his voice clear and confident, "I thought justice meant being tough. I thought being strict meant being fair. But one traffic ticket changed everything I thought I knew about being a judge." The room fell silent as Michael told the story of that day in his courtroom and the dinner that followed. He noticed several young judges leaning forward in their seats, reminding him of himself just 1 year ago. "That day, I didn't just fail to see the person behind the case," he continued. "I failed to see that true justice requires understanding, compassion, and the willingness to listen." From her seat, Sarah nodded slightly. She was wearing the same navy blue suit she had worn to court that day, a detail she had planned carefully for this moment. "Thanks to Mrs. Richardson and Judge Richardson's guidance," Michael said, "I learned that every case that comes before us tells a story. Behind every traffic ticket, every minor violation, there's a human being whose life will be affected by our decisions." He pulled out his well-worn notebook, the same one he had started using after that dinner. "In the past year, my courtroom has changed. We've started a community outreach program where judges spend time understanding the neighborhoods we serve. We've created a mentorship program pairing experienced judges with new ones, focusing on recognizing and addressing our own biases." Michael clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from his courtroom. Complaints about unfair treatment have dropped by 70%, repeat offenses are down by 45%, but more importantly, community trust in our court has increased significantly. He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. "And it all started because one dignified woman showed me grace when I least deserved it and taught me that justice without understanding isn't justice at all." After the presentation, judges from across the state gathered around Michael, asking questions about his programs. A young judge, recently appointed, approached him nervously. "Judge Bennett," she said, "I'm starting my first week on the bench. Any advice?" Michael smiled, remembering his own first week. "Look beyond the law books," he said. "See the people, listen to their stories, and remember that sometimes the greatest lessons come from unexpected teachers." Later that evening, at their regular Sunday dinner, the Richardsons' dining room was filled with warmth and laughter. Sarah's pot roast was perfect as always, but now Michael knew to compliment the green beans from the garden too. "You did well today, son," Judge Richardson said, passing the breadbasket. "You've come a long way from that young judge who was trying so hard to prove himself." Sarah reached over and patted Michael's hand. "You know what made me proudest today? When you mentioned starting that scholarship fund for underprivileged law students. That's how real change happens, by opening doors for others." Michael nodded, thinking of the 5 students already benefiting from the fund. "I've learned that being a judge isn't about wielding power. It's about using our position to make our community better." And to think, Sarah smiled, it all started with a hidden stop sign. Judge Richardson raised his glass. "To hidden stop signs and the lessons they teach us." As they finished dinner, Michael helped Sarah clear the dishes, something he'd never have thought to do a year ago. In the kitchen, she handed him a worn envelope. "What's this?" he asked, opening it to find the photographs she had tried to show him in court that day. "Keep these," she said softly. "Use them to remind other young judges that justice isn't just about what we see on the surface. It's about taking the time to look deeper." Michael carefully tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket, knowing these photos would become part of his teaching materials for the mentorship program. As the evening wound down, Michael looked at the 2 people who had changed not just his career, but his entire understanding of justice. A traffic ticket had brought him to their dinner table, but love, wisdom, and patience had kept him coming back. "Same time next Sunday?" he asked, standing to leave. "Always," Sarah and Judge Richardson replied together, their smiles confirming that some lessons never really end. They just keep growing deeper with time.